Prehistoric Planet is the most recent dinosaur documentary. Created by Jon Favreau and Mike Gunton and premiering on Apple TV, it was a huge success, being the 5th most streamed program in the US in its week of release, and Apple's most watched program. Not bad for a documentary. It featured CGI footage of the Mesozoic life of the late Cretaceous against real backgrounds, all shot in the style of the Planet Earth documentary series with the narration of Sir David Attenborough. All in all, it's a magnificent project, and no doubt one of the most important and influential pieces of paleomedia of our time, and certainly of the 2020s thus far at least. A documentary of this scale and style comes with its own suite of talking points. How did it compare to its predecessors, and how may it shape the future? Let's find out in a meandering look at Prehistoric Planet. Perhaps one of the most noticeable things about Prehistoric Planet after the truly stunning visual effects is its presentation format. This isn't inspired or based on Planet Earth. It is literally Planet Earth with dinosaurs, right down to the last letter. This has a pretty big ripple effect on a lot of other aspects of the documentary. So how did this new format work out, and what are its pros and cons? One thing it should definitely be applauded for is the amount of prehistoric species this format can squeeze in. With 2 less episodes than Walking with Dinosaurs, Ballad of Big Al included, and only taking place at the end of the Cretaceous, it still manages a similar species tally to Walking With. We get a good number of new species here. A handful of new dinosaurs, but mainly a ton of new pterosaurs and plesiosaurs not seen by the public before. With the excellent sequences they're filmed in, these will now no doubt be catapulted into popular culture. We also get updated looks at better known species, and finally a well-fed looking T-Rex, and mosasaurs that finally shirk the traffic cone-faced giant snake look of yesteryear. With some species, the Planet Earth format does very nicely. For animals from relatively barren formations like Carnotaurus and some of the sauropods, you'd really struggle to make a full episode on them. Yet here they can have some of the best sequences in the series devoted entirely to them that likely couldn't happen otherwise. However, my gripes with this format start to arise when we get to the animals that could have had full episodes devoted to them in a Walking With or Dynasties style episode. As a lot of the time with such animals, the comparatively surface level look at them often left me wanting more, and the knowledge that we have good enough fossils to build strong full episodes around such animals often made me wonder if the Planet Earth format was the right choice here. Ice Worlds especially already felt like it should have been in the Walking With format, with either the Nanoxaurus or the Pachyrhinosaurus as the focal animals. The episode keeps on coming back to Cretaceous Canada, with one deviation to watch a sleeping Antarctopelta, in a sequence that really felt more about the glowworm cave than the dinosaur, before pulling a handbrake turn and returning right back to Canada. Why not just cut that, replace Olorotitan with the Edmontosaurus, and have the whole episode there with some narrative and a deeper look at the dinosaurs? Similarly, the repeat usage of certain formations and animals only reinforces this feeling for me as well. With minor cutting and stitching, it feels like the other episodes could just be turned into coastal Montana, Mongolia, and Morocco, with minimal changes. And this also makes further sense as some episodes have very weak ties to their overall theme. Fresh water really sticks out here. Most of the sequences are just animals doing something in the relative proximity of river or lake, and Attenborough then narrating how crazy it was that happened by some fresh water. The lack of depth in some of the depictions I also believe does add another feather to the cap of Walking With style. For a lot of the returning dinosaurs, as nice as they look, we don't get huge amounts of new information on them. It's nice to see T-Rex as a normal animal and a parent, but this really isn't such a different depiction from the Walking With one. The swimming was nice to see, but with the leaps and bounds made in Tyrannosaurus discoveries, I still feel a full episode can be devoted to them, with plenty of new ground to cover, especially their ontogenetic niche partitioning, one of the most interesting newer things about them that arguably lends itself well to a documentary and the general public isn't really aware of. Of a lot of the new cast, I also think more time with them would have been nice as well. In forests, I wish we could have spent more time with the Shanshuosaurus and Corythoraptor in Cretaceous China, instead of something more plain like the Triceratops. This formation really feels like a prime choice for its own episode. There's a lot of interesting stuff here with 8 different oviraptors to show off the niche partitioning in dinosaurs. A gracile tyrannosaur, which is something we only really scratched the surface of in this documentary, a therizinosaur, a sauropod and a hadrosaur for extra flavour too. Haytake Island also feels like it could have been its own episode, as does Late Cretaceous Madagascar, whom we only really scratched the surface with the endearing Mashikasaurus. Chiefly, I wanted more from a lot of the segments that we saw. And this really isn't all bad, as it shows the documentary was doing the right thing to leave me so keen for more. I think for me personally, the surface skimming Planet Earth format wasn't used to the best effect here. If you can go deep, then dive. If you can't, keep it short. Whilst it uses smaller sequences to full effect for things like Dreadnoughtus and Carnotaurus, that you may struggle to get a full episode out of, Prehistoric Planet often keeps it short when it feels like you should dive on quite a few occasions. Of course, this review is written without the inside knowledge of the practicalities of such filmmaking. A few well-known crowd pleasers are necessary to get the casuals in, and finding a complete cast of relatively unknown but reasonably complete specimens in formations without too much temptation for a full episode is challenging, even with so many recent discoveries. Even more so with the time span of the series only being the last few millennia of the Cretaceous, which really was an odd decision itself too. There was occasionally one thing that bugged me in Prehistoric Planet, even if not that common, that I also felt fed into my key gripe with the series. This was seeing scenes from modern documentaries redone with dinosaurs. Whilst some of these were general inspirations, there were some that were almost literal one-to-one rotoscopes, and some scenes that had narration lifted almost verbatim from other documentaries.
Only one thing attracts more flies than the wildebeest. Lions that have eaten wildebeest. If there is one thing that attracts flies more than a carcass, it's a sleeping Tarbosaur that has been feeding on that carcass.
I believe this is effectively an evolutionary offshoot of the paleoart meme, the original defined here by Darren Nash. And not all of these are awful. The Shansuosaurus hunt, whilst literally a rotoscope, isn't that inaccurate. Both tigers and tyrannosaurs would likely use the weather to conceal themselves for a surprise lunge. So whilst it's not an especially creative scene, there's nothing to say Shansuosaurus wouldn't have done this. And it doesn't take up valuable screen time that should have been spent watching it do something else. But even then, this still could have been a much more creative scene. The fact that it's copied by definition means that it's not especially inspired. But then we have other moments like the Tarbosaurus scene, and this was very clearly designed to invoke a classic sequence of the African savannas but in the Mesozoic. The squabbling vultures descending as the lordly lazing lions head off for the night. But really this just reinforces old paleoart memes of scavenging Quetzalcoatlus. As Darkids may well have scavenged, even if their beaks weren't designed for it, it still doesn't stop marabous. But giving them this vulture-like behaviour when this wasn't likely to be hugely common doesn't feel especially right. An outdated idea was used because a certain type of scene was wanted, not because the fossil record suggested it. And I do recognise this as something of a nitpick. After all, it's only a few scenes that form a relatively small percentage of the overall runtime. But I also think they highlight my main gripe with Prehistoric Planet, which is its occasional attempts to use the past to recreate the present, sometimes at the cost of portraying the past how it most likely was. As again, Prehistoric Planet isn't just like Planet Earth. It's constantly trying its absolute hardest to show off how it literally is Planet Earth 2, but in the Cretaceous. The production by the BBC Natural History Unit is fairly evident here, with some of its best and worst tropes it's developed in the past 10 years or so. The sound design is cranked up to 11 and often to the point of being unnecessary. Dinosaurs and other prehistoric life are almost always gurgling, rumbling, chirping, or making some other noise. Every raindrop is a waterfall, every rock dislodged may as well be a landslide, regardless of how far away we hear it from. In some cases, and unlike with extant animals, this does work in favour of the scene. Hearing the individual pops of the Dreadnoughtus neck displays was a nice touch. But whilst the audio can get a bit over the top, the visuals do hit just right. Prehistoric Planet is a stunning tour de force. Some shots are so wonderful they don't even need the dinosaurs. This is not to say that Walking With or Dinosaur Planet were filmed in downtown Scunthorpe or anything, but the leaps and bounds the Natural History Unit have made with both their camera work and camera technology really come into play here. When the dinosaurs are used, their shot composition frames them beautifully in their environments, and no scene is a chore to watch. To be added onto this, the effects are quite exceptional too. Some shots are so good it's hard to believe you're not looking at a real dinosaur. And the visual effects teams have truly outdone themselves here. Not just with the quality of the models, but their integration into the environment too. In the initial approach of the Nanoxaurus to the Pachyrhinosaurus herd, you can see their foot come down, initially land, and then compress the snow, with every step. These effects aren't just beating other TV shows, they're beating most of Hollywood's too. The prehistoric life isn't shy about their close-ups either, and when fully zoomed in, the animals still look just as stunning and realistic. This is the sort of shot Walking With would use a practical effect for. Yet Prehistoric Planet is so good it can afford a close-up of the CGI model. It may be worth pondering if our CGI has gotten so good that for non-human organisms, computer effects have eclipsed practical ones. Maybe someday the tables will turn, and our lifelike robo-dinosaurs will be able to act out any scene we want a la Westworld. Companies like Apple and Disney certainly have the budget, and actually field testing them in exotic locations would make for fine training for their effectiveness in combat for when Jeff Bezos finally snaps and breeds his own Homelander. There are maybe 1 or 2 shots that I think could have benefited from being practical. The Alcyone hatchlings did look a bit odd as they poked out of the substrate they were laid in. Their CGI clashes a bit here with the background, and I feel a practical little pterosaur could have done very well here, just like the sauropodlet scene in Walking With Dinosaurs. There's maybe 1 or 2 scenes where the prehistoric life looks a bit off, mainly in water, but this is still better than 90% of other effects in the industry right now, and it's the worst of a great bunch scenario over them actually being bad per se. Like much of what the Natural History Unit makes these days, Prehistoric Planet is also quite a bloodless series, and I personally believe this to be to its detriment. It's worth noting it isn't deathless. In the first episode alone, a Rexlet is dragged to its watery grave, and dozens of Alcyone flaplings go down like popcorn chicken for the other pterosaurs. There's no doubt these scenes are carefully written to convey risk, violence, and harsh reality in the natural world, but with a minimum of actual blood and suffering, with the young animals disappearing in a single, instant, and probably painless gulp. Like many BBC documentaries though, this gets a bit obvious when it comes to macropredation. Here the shining example being when the Nanoxaurus pack take down an old Pachyrhinosaurus bull. For an animal twice the size of any one of his attackers and built for fight over flight, he holds up as well as wet tissue paper and goes down with little fuss and blood in a matter of seconds. It's all very BBC documentary indeed. No blood or suffering allowed in nature. Not only is graphic violence an essential and unignorable part of predation, especially for animals designed to kill things similar in size to themselves, avoiding it can also limit educational opportunity. An example of my 2 main problems come from what is perhaps my favourite sequence in Prehistoric Planet, the Velociraptor hunt in the freshwater episode. This shows a daring group predate a young Asdarchid on the cliffs beside a waterfall. The whole thing is well written and beautifully shot, and nicely features a bit of scientific backing, with Velociraptor having been found to feed on pterosaurs if not kill them. But it's also quite deliberately being based off snow leopard hunts, so it did make me wonder if this was a missed opportunity. Much of the public still believes the slicing killing claw theory of how dromaeosaurs use their hallux talons. Not many are aware of the more recent and well-supported theory of raptor prey restraint. Was this not really the ideal time to set the record straight? From 90s Jurassic Park myths to current well-supported theory in the most watched and most up-to-date documentary of our time, instead of just replicating a big cat hunt from planet Earth. Raptor prey restraint would no doubt be a bloody and noisy affair to behold, but that's just how dromaeosaurs most likely killed. If that's how animals get their daily bread, then that's an inextricable part of what they are. To not show that is to not show them. You're presenting a sanitized view of them that, at the end of the day, is inaccurate. Obviously, there is a fine line here. If you overstep it, then you wind up with stuff like Jurassic Fight Club, and no one wants derivative Awesome Bro tripe. But too little and you wind up doing what the BBC has done with some of their documentaries, and made them into deathless wonderlands barely a step above Disney films. Another scene that struck me as somewhat whitewashed was the sneaky male scene with the Barbarodactylus. Whilst overall a successful and enjoyable sequence that also catapulted Barbarodactylus into the new status of bi-icon if you will, sneaky males often achieve their success through forced copulations. This isn't the case all the time, and with some species it can often be willing copulations with the sneaky male. But for animals with huge secondary sexual characteristics especially prevalent in males for the sole purpose of breeding success, so likely Barbarodactylus, females tend to be a lot less receptive to sneaky males. So I am mixed on it. It's both not impossible and definitely better that interesting speculation is shown watered down than not at all. But I also can't help but feel that had it actually happened, it may have gone down in a much less palatable way for much of the audience, and that such things shouldn't be avoided if they happen in nature. The dinosaurs still absolutely excel as animals whilst retaining unique designs and characteristics. Gone are the vascular, heroin-chic dinosaurs of the 90s, replaced with the positively thick dinosaurs of the dinosaur revolution, adorned with tassels and wattles and feathers and more. There's not one bad design, and some exceptionally characterful ones. One look at the Dinosaurus is enough to tell you what it smells like. The Tyrannosaurus just feel very powerful and bulky. You get a real sense of their weight from how they move and look. There's some nice speculation too, that feels very in line with the paleontological record. Dreadnoughtus uses its neck as a giant billboard, which is very enjoyable. And it's nice to see sexual selection visually portrayed in dinosaurs outside of ceratopsians too. There's also the tongue of the Mononychus. I've seen some exhibit skepticism over this and compare it to an anteater, but this is something some birds have. Woodpeckers have very long tongues to probe into the holes they've drilled in wood, just as Mononychus is believed to have done. Really, there's no reason for it not to have one from what we believe about how it fed. Behaviour-wise, there's some good stuff as well. The displaying Carnotaurus is a wonderful scene, as is the Hoffman's mosasaur stopping by for a scrub-up. For every copied modern documentary scene, there were 5 more that left me pleased and impressed. For a series that lacks a narrative for its episodes, it still manages some good show-don't-tell information as well. The Dinosaurus scene tells you a lot about the animal through its design and action, with comparatively little narration. And even in some of the shorter scenes, the narration still gets a lot done. The Mononychus scene is excellent in this regard, economically showing practical uses for each part of its anatomy as it forages. 1 or 2 scenes were a bit iffy for me though. Some feel a bit odd, a bit more like B-roll. The Therizinosaurus counts here as we see the youngsters struggle for a beehive. An adult shows up, smacks it down and then dips, and that's about it. For such a bizarre and unique theropod, I feel the general public could have done with a bit more of an in-depth portrayal, rather than have them believe it's some Mesozoic Winnie the Pooh. There's also the Dromaeosaur hunt in Ice Worlds, that shows a trio of coyote-sized theropods harass a herd of elephant-sized Edmontosaurus into a free meal. And this felt pretty unbelievable. I do believe dromaeosaurs may well have been opportunists up for any meal, but the notion of the giant hadrosaurs panicking over them, or really having much reaction at all, felt like a bit much. Again, this isn't like the size difference between a deer and a cat. It's literally as far apart as an elephant and a jackal. The calf the predators wind up with looks out of their league, let alone one of the adults even batting an eye at them. Hadrosaurs in general can feel a bit underdone here as well. The assorted scenes telling us about the various environments of the Cretaceous were all great, but it always feels like the hadrosaurs are used for them, and it's never really about them over the environment. This very successful family of dinosaurs feels a bit like it's a proxy to learn more about their surroundings. But how is it accuracy-wise? And overall top-notch. There are a few small mistakes like the Dreadnoughtus claw or the Carnotaurus skin, but many of these are very forgivable. as the contradictory evidence was published in the making of when things were beyond changing. There's one or two time or place slip-ups, nothing as egregious as Walking With's Euroraptor though. The pterosaurs seem to get just about everywhere at times, regardless of their formation, but anyone who likes birds will know that vagrants can appear anywhere really, so I think I'm fine with this. One thing that did stick out was the Triceratops cave scene. The whole clay-absorbing toxins thing isn't very well supported at all. In animals like macaws at least, it seems much more like they're there for minerals, and they can handily eat poisonous plants without requiring clay. So that's a bit of a speed bump there. As well as this being another thing that came a little too close to the scene of elephants doing the same in Life of Mammals, but for salt, which probably would have made a lot more sense. There's also a lot of indeterminate species in Prehistoric Planet, and this isn't bad. Again, it avoids another Euroraptor incident, but at the same time it can get a bit much when half the scenes in an episode we don't actually know who or what we're dealing with. The extensive cast list of dinosaurs in prehistoric life is another strength. Whilst it doesn't have as many newcomers as Walking With, this is again due to its production time. I imagine when a lot of them were thought up, this would have been the first big role for such animals. You can't really blame them for not predicting amazing dino worlds. And there's certainly nothing wrong with species getting multiple appearances across media. Between Amazing Dino Worlds, Prehistoric Planet and David Armsby's Dinosauria, Nanoxaurus is having an absolutely bumper decade for exposure, making a serious attempt at clawing its way to becoming the second most famous tyrannosaur. I think the real winners of Prehistoric Planet are the pterosaurs though. Barbarodactylus, Phosphatodraco, Alcyone and Hategopteryx all get their first big media appearances here, and all of them get well thought out show-stealing moments in their respective episodes. No doubt these will have them as a lot of people's new favourite prehistoric animals for certain. Key components of their behaviour, like the recent findings of their different life stages, are nicely shown in the flapling rush in Coasts, and as darkids in general do very well here with lots of good screen time. Plesiosaurs also get something of a significant facelift in this series, and some aspects of their biology are showcased in ways never really brought to public attention before. They're shown to give birth to live young, and caring for them afterwards in social groups. Considering the size of plesiosaur young on birth, this seems very likely. And with Prehistoric Planet, plesiosaurs are turned from monsters of the deep into the cetaceans of the Mesozoic. A natural question may be, how does it compare to Walking with Dinosaurs? Well, there's no doubt the two feel like very different beasts. Whilst throughout this video I've compared the two as to how they use their respective mediums, watching them together there's no doubt they just feel like separate entities. I do think Prehistoric Planet is a lot more cautious in its speculation. Even with the Revolution dinosaurs there's no Megapleurodon, that's for sure. In the same way we adjust for inflation when comparing the box office of various films, if we adjust for new discoveries in paleontology, I'd still say Prehistoric Planet gets the accuracy award as well. Despite this though, Walking With does have its pros here in that it shows you much more of the Mesozoic. The choice to focus only on the end of the Cretaceous really does limit Prehistoric Planet. And the luxury of spending all episode in one place means Branagh can pull up the handbrake and talk in depth about certain topics. And both of these contribute to Walking With feeling more educational at the time, even if much of the knowledge is now outdated. Walking With feels more like a walk through a museum. Prehistoric Planet feels like you're on safari for one night and are rushing around to see everything before getting back to the lodge for dinner. And effects, of course, isn't really a contest here. There are several other points that likely vary from person to person in their importance, both in overall terms and in comparisons to other media. Reduced time with the individual dinosaurs and no focal animals to centre episodes on robs many of the scenes of much of a narrative or any emotional impact. Indeed, anyone hoping for even a fraction of the pathos of Death of a Dynasty, Giant of the Skies or The Ballad of Big Al, or of individual scenes like the death of the Postosuchus, will likely be left wanting after Prehistoric Planet. Similarly, for me personally, Hans Zimmer's score doesn't really come close to Benjamin Bartlett's for the Walking With series. In fact, overall the score in Prehistoric Planet could often feel a bit limp. With a few exceptions like the Dinokairos scene and the Deserts episode, music doesn't play an especially large role here. And whilst it's competent at what it does, it rarely gets especially creative or exceptional. I do feel Zimmer as a whole can get a bit samey, creating the same typically epic orchestras and not much outside of that. If I hadn't seen Dune, I'd be tempted to say he'd become a bit generic over the last 10 years or so. I also felt this was the case for his scores of Planet Earth 2 and Blue Planet 2 as well. It's hard to say if this is his choice or just the direction he was given for such documentaries, but I personally was left a bit unsatisfied. Getting some new blood in would have been nice, or even another quality musician from past series. Benji Mendelssohn's score for Dynasties I considered pretty good, and would fit well for a lot of Prehistoric Planet's scenes and subject matter as well. But both of these points are just matters of personal taste. Whilst they were things I felt worth noting, they didn't derail the show for me, and you may find them completely irrelevant to yourself, or maybe even game-breakingly important. To sum up, despite how negative I may seem in parts of this video, I really did like Prehistoric Planet. If I seem overly harsh on it with the nitpicks, well, picking nits improves the health of the animal. A documentary that's overall as good as this is really above the few silly or self-indulgent mistakes it makes. Think of it of being like a teacher and seeing your best student flunk the easy questions in the exam. Because it is a fantastic, accurate, well-produced effort that hits all of its major bases and gives us the best paleo documentary that we've had in decades. It comes strongly recommended by me, and I can only hope for more of this. It has already been suggested that we will get more, and it's interesting to speculate when and where future programs will go. Will it be the same format but Jurassic? The same format but taking from the whole Mesozoic, or the Cenozoic? Or back to a Dynasties or Walking with series style of presentation? Who knows? Thinking about past paleomedia, I think there's also one forgotten format that may also work well. The life of format. Used for the life of mammals, birds, life in cold blood, and so on, this rather breaks episodes into physiological topics like different types of diet, courtship and reproduction, and adaptations for habitats. It can allow for the relatively short scenes that Prehistoric Planet prefers, but whilst taking from multiple time periods, as well as perhaps being the most directly educational format, but without lacking a unifying theme, even if it still lacks narrative and the things that come with it. It's tremendously arrogant to assume any of this will ever reach relevant ears and make a difference, but such things are still worth discussing for and in the culture that surrounds paleomedia. It's also interesting to just pause and look at the general state of paleomedia now as well. As the third and final Jurassic World film flops critically as everyone imagined, it does seem like the shackles of Universal are finally beginning to break. Between Prehistoric Planet, independent projects like David Armsby's Dinosauria, and animation like Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal, as well as assorted video games, it seems like dinosaurs are finally for everyone again. It's quite interesting but also sad how the first Jurassic Park spawned a huge spike in paleomedia, like the Walking with series and Disney's Dinosaur, but in contrast, Jurassic World completely suffocated the genre. Until now, that is. Thanks for watching. If this is your first video of mine, I hope you enjoyed it and found it worth your time. This channel often deals with fictitious animals, but if you want more paleo content, there's a video I've done on the Walking with series, as well as one on Jurassic Park you might find interesting. If you're keen on my other stuff as well, then consider liking and subscribing, and hopefully I'll see you next time. For my regulars, things are back to normal for the next video, and let's make it a surprise as to who it'll be.